Hey kids, before we slash into the 15-year journey of Freddy vs. Jason, I wanted to give a quick shout out to the crowdfunding campaign for In Search of Darkness 2, the second part of the epic documentary chronicling the rise of horror films. It's an exhaustive love letter to the genre featuring tons of interviews from the filmmakers, actors, and fans that made horror the powerhouse it is today. If you want to help support me and What Happened, click the link in the description to check out the campaign if you are so inclined. Here's but a taste of what you can expect from the finished film, which of course is very relevant to our subject today.
The second one, to me, is the only true definition of a sequel. This is the first appearance of Jason as the killer.
The chase at the end, to me, is one of my favorite final moments. The rat going under the bed and peeing underneath it.
I love that scene where they're in what we call the shade, Jason, with the head there and all the candles.
So much scarier than any of the other ones. I think that's probably why it's my favorite.
What happens when you take two of the most iconic movie villains of all time, place them in a blood-soaked gladiatorial battle for the right to slaughter helpless horny souls, go through a million script rewrites, cut tons of material out of the final script, and then release it almost 10 years after you promised it? Well, you wind up with the newest episode of What Happened, the show that cuts and carves through the video games, movies, and etceteras that have seen some shit. And make no mistake, today's subject saw some shit, because while it came out in the early stumbling years of the 2000s, 2003 more specifically, its journey to hack its way into theaters actually started way earlier than some might think. So grab your machete and pull on your razored-fingered glove. It's time to plunge our hands deep into the gushing guts and monster meat of Freddy vs. Jason. It's the year of our Lord, 1987, which is always in contention for the greatest year ever. Seriously, look up the amount of shit that came out in 87. And both the Friday the 13th and Nightmare on Elm Street franchises are at an impasse. Dream Warriors and Jason Lives had just come out, and the franchise holders of both series, Paramount and New Line, were thinking of where Frederick and Mr. Voorhees would go to next. They both felt that a crossover between the two sultans of slashing would be a great way to give fans something unexpected, and of course, result in a boffo box office. Does anyone say boffo anymore? No? Shit. But unfortunately, both movie studios turned out to be greedy children. Who would have thought? Neither wanted to license out their character to the other studio. Therefore, discussions stalled until eventually, nobody gets a movie. This then resulted in both villains getting random pivots in their general storylines. Jason fought with an 80s era Jean Grey, while Freddy became a father. This is where things get interesting. Despite some palpable hype among fans and casuals, 1989's Jason Takes Manhattan, the most expensive Friday the 13th at that time, bombed at the box office, barely squeaking out a profit. This resulted in Paramount giving up the rights to Friday Films, which reverted back to its original owners. They then sold Jason off to New Line Cinema, finally placing the hockey mask and fedora under the same umbrella. Sean S. Cunningham, the creator of the original Friday, was set to start developing a treatment for Freddy vs. Jason, now that the irritating teen nerd called licensing issue had been slain. Unfortunately, it simply took took too long for the project to make any real headway, and by that time, Wes Craven dreamed up the New Nightmare, which then pushed the Versus battle even farther out. Cunningham, with his plans now squashed, then decided to fart out Jason Goes to Hell as the first Friday film under New Line, which, in one of the greatest understatements of all time, wasn't exactly well received. Things weren't going well for either boogeyman, because financially, both The Final Friday and The New Nightmare, despite attempting some very out-of-the-box things, were kind of massive mistakes, posting some of the lowest box office receipts for either franchise, which, considering the last few entries, was kind of impressive. Now, there was one scene in Jason Goes to Hell that Cunningham made sure to include, a scene that would, within legal reasoning, guarantee that Freddy vs. Jason would eventually become a reality. That scene was Freddy's clawed glove pulling Jason's mask into, presumably, judging by the title of the movie, Hell, which mercifully ended that film. The Final Friday was released in 1993, and it would be a further 10 more years before this promise was ever fulfilled. During that decade, New Line heads of production spent over $6 million just commissioning scripts, dozens and dozens of scripts from various screenwriters. What these scripts kept getting stuck on was trying to find the reasoning as to why two titanic titans of terror would be crossing paths. Some of these pitches included rewriting the canon of both series, putting forward the idea that Freddy Krueger in his younger years was one of the original counselors at Camp Crystal Lake who let Jason die, despite that making no sense for every reason you can think of. Another take was Jason being put on trial for his many atrocities over the years, which, while insane, I would pay good money to see. In fact, I'd imagine the only people who wouldn't want to see that would be liars. Anyway, it wasn't until those magical early 2000s where Damian Shannon and Mark Swift, two massive fans of both series, made their pitch to then New Line head of production Michael DeLuca, where things finally started to get moving. In an article at Bloody Disgusting, both writers recalled how excited DeLuca was. "We had a very strong take from the beginning on what the movie should be and what the movie should not be, so Michael got the full pitch. Characters, story, action set pieces, everything. DeLuca had explored so many ideas at that point that he was really lost as to where to start. We came from a place where we didn't want to change their backstories at all. We didn't want to throw out the other movies. We wanted everything to count. We pitched what we as fans wanted to see. DeLuca loved it and hired us pretty quickly after that pitch." Then DeLuca was fired. See, Jason X had come out under his watch and remains the least profitable Friday the 13th movie of all time, as it made $16 million worldwide on a budget of 14. By comparison, the original Friday in 1980 made $60 million on a budget of a mere $550,000. So, with this massive failure under his belt, DeLuca, the champion of 80s slashers, was hoofed out of New Line. This left Swift and Shannon to reconvince a whole new set of executives on Freddy vs. Jason's viability. As an aside, 9 times out of 10, 60% of the time, if a movie has problems, it's usually due to this type of thing. Every time. This reconvincing phase pushed things back even further. The writing duo had to make presentations, lay out all the franchise rules, actually educate these executives on the history and past box office success of both characters. It was seemingly never ending, with the pencil pushers still unconvinced whether those fan bases even existed anymore. In a last-ditch effort, Swift and Shannon begged the execs to do more market research and suggested New Line take out small teams to malls across America with questionnaires to gauge fan interest. Now, this resulted in fans indeed wanting to see Freddy vs. Jason.
That's good.
But somehow, the market research said the movie should be PG-13.
That's bad.
Can I go now?
The writing duo were aghast when they saw this feedback, no doubt bolstered by stuffy soccer moms.
Parents just don't understand.
New Line execs were of course considering it, despite the fact that every single entry in both Nightmare and Friday, 17 films in total, were all rated R. When we heard this, we wrote an impassioned email to the head of marketing at the studio, begging him to not only back the movie, but to keep an R rating. Thankfully, cooler heads prevailed here, and New Line finally gave Swift and Shannon the green light to start the script, with the intention to keep the red stuff flowing. God, imagine that. Imagine taking two R-rated monsters and watering it down to make a PG-13 bore fest. Ridiculous. And who would do that? Unfortunately, the already troubled production was not out of the woods just yet, as eventually both writers would find their beloved script hacked to pieces. Their original draft equated to about 2 hours of running time, uncommon for most horror films, with them justifying this by saying that bringing in two legendary characters and all their associated lore would need extra room to breathe. The New Line execs disagreed and ordered any superfluous dialogue to be removed, character backstories to be simplified, and an epic fight between Freddy, Jason, and a hapless teenager in a construction trailer to be cut. Fortunately, the spine of the script was kept very much intact. Freddy, forgotten by the children of Elm Street due to some precautions enacted by their parents, finds Jason's soul wandering the bowels of hell and manipulates him into begin slaughtering anew in the neighborhood, which, given its history, would be credited to Freddy. This then reawakens the madman's insight within the local teens, which in turn powers Freddy back up to his 80s era power level. Thing is, Jason is not that easily controlled and starts killing off characters before Mr. Krueger can, which makes Frederick understandably upset. Therefore, Freddy vs. Jason! Now, as for the director who would film the immovable object fighting against the unstoppable force, why, the director of decades of Chinese action films, of course. Ronnie Yu had produced and helmed dozens of movies since the 70s, but at the tail end of the 90s broke into American cinema with films like The 51st State, but more importantly, Bride of Chucky.
Nobody move!
Ronnie, while not being familiar with either Freddy or Jason, still knew what he wanted and had a clear vision on how to execute it, which is more than you can say about a lot of directors, not naming names. However, that clear vision included making a big casting change to one of the two main characters, namely Jason Voorhees, who wasn't particularly happy about this.
Dude, that goalie was pissed about something.
While the Nightmare franchise hinged greatly on the sinister and, as time went on, cheesy performance of Robert Englund, the first 6 films of Friday the 13th always put a new actor under the makeup. It wasn't until part 7 where Kane Hodder really inhabited the role, giving Jason a lot of subtle but distinct nuances. Hodder was the first actor to play Jason multiple times and remains the one who played him the most, 4 films in total, making him the clear fan favorite. Now, while there has been some conflicting reports as to the reason why, Hodder was never formally contacted to reprise the role for the big showdown. Instead, Ken Kirzinger, a stunt actor who appeared briefly in Jason Takes Manhattan, was chosen instead. This of course led to a not unsubstantial fan outcry when horror magazines and websites reported the news. We were as shocked as anyone when Kane wasn't brought back. After all, Kane played Jason more times than anyone else and kept the torch of the franchise alive between movies. We also think Ken did a great job in the role, and we like the fact that there have been so many interpretations of Jason Voorhees throughout the years. Now, the most common reasoning for this change is that either New Line execs or Ronnie Yu or both felt that to give the movie a better contrast, Jason should tower over Freddy, a wit versus brawn sort of deal, and Kirzinger had Hodder beat by a few inches. It's a theory that Swift and Shannon subscribed subscribe to? You would have to ask the director and the studio, but if I had to take an educated guess, I would say they probably felt that Ken matched up better visually with Robert, and maybe they saved some money, but again, you'd have to ask them. So going into Freddy vs. Jason's opening weekend, there was already a certain amount of fan ire, mostly from the Jason camp, who felt with 10 years of built-up anticipation, it was a bit sad to not get the two most iconic actors face-to-face in full makeup. But even with all those delays, script rewrites, and casting changes, it didn't stop Freddy vs. Jason from setting a record at the box office for a horror film at the time, making $36 million in its opening weekend and $114 million worldwide, against a modest budget of $25. Reviews were what you'd expect from something called Freddy vs. Jason, but it was the fans who overall were pleased with the results, given the developmental hell it had to go through. But when you are trying to appease two rabid fan bases, you're certainly not going to please them all. Elm Street residents felt the movie relied too heavily on the Friday films and tried to somewhat make Jason the de facto hero, whereas Crystal Lake campers felt quite the opposite, and that Freddy got way more screen time. At the end of the day, that probably means Swift and Shannon got it mostly right, getting the proportions just so that they didn't anger any one side too much. From the very beginning, we strove for balance. You have to fight for this balance and these decisions through every step of the development process. It's a miracle it came out as balanced as it is, though of course, fans always want their favorite character to have more. Even though it made a killing at the box office, there was strangely never any serious talk of a sequel, and that's because the plan was always for F vs. J to reignite the fan bases enough that both film series could continue independently. And that's just what it did, sorta. The Friday the 13th reboot unseated Freddy vs. Jason in 2009 by claiming the new record for best horror movie opening with $40 million. And while that record's been shattered several times since, it still stands in the top 10 of best debuts. Several sequels were proposed to capitalize on this newfound success, but for one reason or a dozen of others, never materialized, and it seems that, unfortunately, we won't be seeing Jason stalk the shores of Crystal Lake anytime soon.
Jason can be getting up and walking around anytime soon?
We really nailed that fucker.
He wasn't nothing but a big old pussy anyway.
The Nightmare on Elm Street reboot, released a year later, also surprisingly did big numbers, but the reviews and especially fan reaction were much more dire, and with the passing of Wes Craven, Freddy's chances of clawing back into our minds also seem rather slim. Ronnie Yu would go on to the next logical project after Freddy vs. Jason, Jet Li's Fearless. And finally, Swift and Shannon, due to their work on FVJ, handled the writing duties on the aforementioned Friday reboot, which isn't surprising because as far as remake things go, it was surprisingly well done, unlike their script for the 2017 Baywatch movie that I just remembered even exists. All the films we've covered thus far here on What Happened have been, in no uncertain terms, unmitigated disasters, either from fan reactions or box office results, so it was nice covering something that, despite a million setbacks, delays, and close shaves with disaster, was able to come out the other end relatively unscathed, making for one of the very few Versus movies that didn't disappoint. Unlike, I don't want to cover that. If you know of any other films, video games, or other form of media really that have had twisted tales of developmental turmoil, scream it up in the comments below, slash your way over to my Twitter, or haunt the ghostly halls of the Flophouse VIP Patreon and become a big boss to nominate the subject of a future episode. See you next time, kids, and thanks for watching!